Welcome to Earnscliffe's continuing webinar series, Canada in Uncertain Times. Today we're going to talk about the final days, the home stretch in the 2020 presidential campaign, and what we might anticipate after. My name is Allan Gregg. I'm one of 40 principals in the Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Those of you who might not be familiar with our firm, we are a public affairs advisory company with specialization in government relations, strategic communications, and public opinion research. Today, we've got a great panel. Returning from our first series is Sarah Goldfeder. Sarah is a former staffer in the U.S. Embassy, now Earnscliffe's expert on Canada-U.S. relations and trade. Rick Anderson, another principal, bi-coastal from both Vancouver and Ottawa. And joining us is our special guest, Les Spivey. Les is the managing principal and CEO of the Alpine Group, one of the top government relations and public affairs companies in the world. Thank you for all joining me. Before we start the conversation, I want to bring in our resident nerd in America file, Charles Bird, he's going to walk us through some of the most recent polling numbers and also to show some contrasts between what we were talking about and looking at in 2016 at this same time compared to what we're talking about today. Take it away, Charles.
Thanks, Alan. Greatly appreciated. Nice to see you all again 2 weeks from our last webinar on the U.S. presidential campaign. I'm just going to share a quick presentation. Now, here's an overview as prepared by Real Clear Politics of the Electoral College based on composite polling. You'll see from the graphic at the bottom right that the red and pink states are solidly likely or leaning Trump, while the dark and light blue states are solidly likely or leaning Biden. And we showed this map during our first webinar on the US presidential campaign 2 weeks ago. And the only difference between that map and the map now is that Minnesota is now considered a toss-up state as opposed to leaning Biden as it was 2 weeks ago. So that brings Biden's tally of electoral college votes from 226 to 216. Now, Biden still enjoys a considerable advantage in the electoral college on the basis of these numbers, needing to find only another 54 electoral college votes to reach the magic number of 270 to be elected president. Now, this next slide shows what happens in the Electoral College if the polling on a state-by-state basis turns out to be correct, which it almost never is. Now, when I showed this slide 2 weeks ago, Ohio was actually leaning Biden and is now leaning Trump, where the composite polling shows a lead for Trump in this state of 0.6%. Now, notwithstanding this shift, the Electoral College map continues to show a potentially commanding lead for Joe Biden and the makings of a veritable landslide. And just for the record, a true landslide in the vernacular of US presidential elections means that a presidential candidate gets more than 55% of the total votes cast nationally. Now, that seems all but unthinkable in the current context, but it's actually happened on 18 occasions during contested US presidential elections, the most recent being Ronald Reagan in 1984. So if we go back to the map, which included the toss-up states, I've taken the liberty of putting Texas, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina in the Trump column. Now, this scenario is far from certain. In fact, the state-by-state composite polling shows Trump leading only in Texas at the moment and actually trailing Biden in Florida by 1.6%, trailing him in Georgia by 1.2%, and Trump trailing Biden in North Carolina by 2.3%. So just given how the math is working out, it seems reasonable to assume that Trump will have to carry most, if not all, of these states to have a realistic path to 270 electoral college votes and re-election. Now, of the remaining toss-up states in gray, Biden currently leads the composite polling in all of them. He's up by more than 6 points in Minnesota. He's up by nearly 8 points in Michigan. He's leading by 4 points in Pennsylvania. He's up by 6 points in Wisconsin, more than 3 points in Arizona, and nearly 2 points in Iowa. So I've made reference to the composite polling, and I wanted to show it to you because it's actually really interesting, especially that it shows what the polling indicated exactly 4 years ago during the 2016 presidential campaign. Obviously, Hillary Clinton leading in most states with substantial leads in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. These were all 3 states that Trump won by less than 1% of the statewide vote. And you'll note that for every state shown on the list, Trump manages to outperform the composite polling averages, and in some cases by a considerable margin. In Ohio, he actually shifts 7 points, this being what the polling said, this being what the actual results were. Iowa, similarly, more than 7 points. Wisconsin, nearly 7.5 points. Michigan, 8 points, 8.5 points actually. And Florida, just under a 3-point shift. Now, it's funny, these 5 states, Ohio, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Florida, have something else in common. They all went for Obama in both 2008 and 2012, but ended up going with Trump in 2016. Now, there's been a lot written and said about why voters in these particular states did what they did, and I think our panelists will be touching upon that to a fair extent. But what's clear is that in 2016, there were a lot of Trump supporters out there that the pollsters just didn't pick up. So we'll have to see if that's the case in 2020. But if it is the case, if we do see a similar shift in what the pollsters say to what the actual vote is, similar to what happened in 2016, this is what happens. You actually end up with Donald Trump being reelected. In fact, this is nearly identical to the results of 2016, with the only difference being that Georgia ends up in the, I'm sorry, my apologies, I got the wrong slide. Georgia ends up in the Democratic column because of the sort of strange mathematical formulation we're using for the purpose of this exercise. If you got to think, though, that if Trump's winning Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Florida, Arizona, he's probably winning Georgia, and he's winning over 300 electoral college seats. So let me show you in closing what I think is a much more realistic scenario as we approach Election Day. Let's assume that Trump wins where he has to in order to avoid a blowout at the hands of Joe Biden. So we're going to give Trump Arizona, we're going to give him Florida, we're going to give him Georgia, we're going to give him North Carolina, and we're going to give him Iowa, all very plausible. Conversely, we're going to give Biden Minnesota, we're going to give him Wisconsin, and we're going to get him Michigan. So you'll see that that leaves you with a deadlock in the Electoral College of 259 to 259, and all eyes on the last remaining swing state, which is Pennsylvania. And it so happens that Pennsylvania is one of 4 states out of 50 that waits until Election Day to count its mail-in ballots. And we all know how many mail-in ballots there are to be counted. So it suggests that we may not know the results from Pennsylvania till very late in the evening, or conceivably following Election Day. One thing to watch, of course, is always Florida. Florida tends to report reasonably early, like the 2000 presidential election, the Gore-Bush deadlock being the notable exception. But if Florida goes Biden, we'll probably have a good sense of that happening by about 9 o'clock Eastern on election night. And if that happens, then Joe Biden is the 46th president of the United States. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Charles. Lots of different scenarios unfolding there, and lots to talk about. Notwithstanding all those permutations and combinations, I mean, virtually all the big poll aggregators right now have got Biden up about 10 points with 12 days to go. I mean, since the 1980s, Sarah, we've always talked at this time of year about the October surprise. Is there anything that could happen, any events or possibilities that could fundamentally alter American sentiment and voting choice in the next 12 days?
I think what we've seen in this particular election is a very stable and divided electorate. And so, there's not a lot of room there in the undecided column. People have pretty much made up their minds. So I think the question really is about turnout, and this remaining sliver of the electorate that is waiting till election day to vote, and how what actually happens that day. But I think overall we've seen a lot of those pieces come into the game board already. A lot of surprises this October, and it hasn't really moved the dial on how people have been talking about their candidate.
The Judiciary Committee just this afternoon, has sent Amy Coney Barrett's nomination for approval. Anyone think that's got a prospect of giving Trump any kind of boost? Rick, Les?
Yeah, yes, Alan, I think I do. Because I think the difference in what Charles was just outlining isn't just, problems with polling, although, as you know well, that's become a more challenging profession and science over the years. But also that Trump has got a more motivated voter. What the confirmation of the Supreme Court justice does is it reminds some of his voters of the one thing they actually all agree they really like about him, which is what he's doing with the Supreme Court, the transformation of the Supreme Court through his appointment. So yes, I think it's a very good thing for him to have in the window in the dying days of the election.
What about less a knockout punch in the debate tonight? I mean, is that possible? Or again, as Americans just seen everything they have to see about these two guys and there's no prospect of any surprises?
I think with President Trump, you've never seen everything, right? You just don't know what to expect next. So could there be a knockout punch in the debate? I don't think there would be a knockout punch, but I think if there are some zingers in there that stick, or there's some flubs that happen, I think that would be something to be noteworthy. As far as a knockout punch, no, I think I'd say on SCOTUS and some about that, I would go along with Rick, and then and Sarah as well, as far as get off the vote. I don't think it moves the needle that much. If there was a long, drawn out situation like with Kavanaugh, I think it maybe can move some votes, but it gets out the base for the president more than anything else.
Sarah, you want to add anything on the confirmation of Barrett or the prospect of a knockout punch tonight in the debates?
I don't think that the Supreme Justice or the Supreme Court Justice issue is going to make a difference at this point in the election. I do think that there is the potential for the debate to turn voters off from voting. So the voters that have not voted yet are the ones that I would look to be kind of the group that is the most in play still. And those people may see something on tonight's debate that they just frustrate them with government and frustrate them with the notion of being a participant.
Interesting. Rick, let's talk about the debates. I mean, you've been part of debate preparation in Canada with political leaders. I mean, if you were coaching Trump, what would you tell him to do? What does he got to do tonight?
Well, what a challenge that would be. My advice to him would be to do the one thing he actually can't do, which is shut up. Because what people have not seen much of in this campaign, in this election, is Joe Biden. We're seeing a very subdued Joe Biden. Trump likes to talk about that, Sleepy Joe, et cetera, et cetera. But they haven't seen much of Joe. And that's because Joe Biden is not a particularly strong candidate. And it's a mistake, I think, for Trump to do what he did in the last debate, which is to drown out Joe with all the theatrics and the bullying and the interjections and everything else. If he could just sit back and let Joe try to complete a couple of sentences and a couple of paragraphs, not reading from a script. I think that what Sarah just referred to could well happen, which is that some portion of Democratic or independent voters would be less inclined to see Joe as a salvation to an era they want to get out of.
Okay, then what does Joe have to do?
Avoid that. He should let Trump be Trump and stand back and let him do another exercise like he did a few weeks ago, which is remind people of what a crude, boorish, bullying, aggressive, mean, angry person he is, which works for his base, but they already know that and turns off almost everybody else. Joe should not interfere with that.
So you've got both candidates basically saying nothing. That's an interesting strategy. Anyway, Les, I want to change subjects a little bit. I mean, we're being told that Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the main, if not the issue that is driving voter sentiment today. I mean, is that your take on things, or are there all kinds of other things at play as well?
Well, that's the main thing, right, Alan, is if you go back to January, February, and if you're a Republican, you're watching these debates on the Democrat side, 20 of them trying to go as far left as possible, you're saying there's no way Trump loses this thing. Then the pandemic occurs, right? And the postmortem, just in living in the middle of it, is there's lots of things that could have done better. There's lots of things that have gone wrong, and you can go down a laundry list and argue over those things. But it is still the single most important thing in my mind that has turned this election, right, and will continue to turn this election. And if you're looking on cable news network, if you're a Democrat, you're going to point towards how many deaths there are, how many infections there are. We'll continue to do that because that's their talking point, and they should stick to that, right? I mean, because it's working for them, because they had an economy that was running so well before this, and then there's a lot of floundering going on and indecision in the White House and infighting. You play to that strength of your own. That's their problem on the Republican side.
Well, help me then, if that's the case, on Trump's strategy to continue to have these big rallies with no social distancing and people pointing, saying, that's the problem. Are these things helping or hurting his cause?
Yeah, no, the rallies, that's for the base, right? It's showing that we're strong. I'm the tough guy. You know, you can wear your mask, not wear your mask. Look at me, I made this through this. They counted me out for dead. But this is for his base, right? This is showing that we can still get out, as he would say, Biden doesn't get out of his basement. Get out there, let's get the economy going, let's get the schools open. So this plays right towards his base and towards what Sarah's saying. It's like, it's about getting out the vote. And this goes towards the voting. It's like you're going to see a big turnout for his base on that day. You would think, instead of the early voting on that side, they're showing we're going to get out there and vote no matter what.
Sarah, we saw Charles' various different scenarios and maps, the last one being a virtual dead heat with Pennsylvania, one of 4 states that hasn't even started counting the ballots until November 3rd, being the only one holding out. The networks seem to be trying to get their viewers ready for that possibility, that we're not going to know the outcome of the election on election night. Are they just being overly cautious, or is that probably the most likely scenario to unfold on November 3rd?
I think it is a likely scenario on November 3rd. And I also think it's not just so much that they're being cautious, but if you think back to 2000, the networks took a lot of heat for a lot of the dissension and the negativity in the American electorate as that election was called. And so they're very careful now about how they call elections, what they use in their modeling. And I think that what they're trying to telegraph to the American people right now is don't expect us to call a winner on election night. And it's probably going to be a while. And I think it's not just the media who's doing this. You also hear this from politicians themselves, cautioning for, patience and for waiting for a period of time. There's every state gets to decide how they're going to count their ballots. Every state gets to assess how they're going to deal with mail-in ballots, how they're going to deal with absentee ballots. So they all have this variety of this patchwork of different procedures post election day that is really going to come into play. And then you have the potential, and one of the questions that has come in through the Q&A is, is there a potential that there's going to be a challenge on some of these results? And I would say without question, there's going to be challenges to some of these districts, to some of these states, and the way that the vote falls down. So, I think that having patience and waiting for, and it's not going to necessarily be a couple of days, it may be a few weeks, it may even, creep into the new year. And the American electorate needs to be patient about this, and as does the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's important context, because I wasn't aware, that there were, I knew that voting was run at a state level, but had no idea that the variance in terms of the rules and procedures, some states don't have to report till the 16th of November. I want to talk more about that, and also that eventuality, because it's obviously pretty important, if not scary. But I forgot to mention, as I almost always do, that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Some of the listeners have already kind of posed a question. We'll be monitoring that over the course of the conversation. And Sarah, do you see anything there that you want to raise with the group?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of questions on polling, and one I kind of addressed in my answer, but another one that's up there is, have we made the adjustments in polling? And this is something that I don't know how you feel about this, Alan, but I think Les had kind of spoken to this earlier in one of our pre-panel conversations. But what the polling actually reflects in the American electorate right now, how responsive is it to how the American voters are actually planning to vote?
Les, you want to take that one?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, and the discussion we're having earlier is, for example, I live in Northern Virginia, so we're right across Potomac River, right from DC. And so Northern Virginia, as you would say, and as many of y'all might have seen, the Washington Post said that Biden is polling 11 points up in Virginia, which I believe that poll. Actually, that's probably I'd probably say it's somewhere 11 to 13 in some of the things I'm seeing. But at the same time, they've got to run up the score in Northern Virginia, because if you go back to 4 years ago, you may remember watching in Virginia, Trump had Virginia won until Fairfax County came in. Fairfax County is the where people are leaving DC and they want better schools and more land and a yard. It's where people are moving to. And so once Fairfax County reported, of course, Trump doesn't win Virginia. So the point of the polling is our phone rings as we work from home all day, every day, all day long in polling, and it pops up on the TV, on the Comcast, and it shows you who's calling. We never answer the phone, right? We have cell phones, we have computers, we got everything going on. We don't answer the landline unless my mom calls, right? And so that's, I think, as you look at the polling as before, it's so hard to determine those people that are working or they're not picking up that phone.
No, and listen, I've been in the business for 40 years, and there's only probably two areas where things are worse, significantly worse today than they were 40 years ago. One is the quality of pot, and secondly is the quality of public opinion polling. We just don't have a distribution system anymore that allows us to reach a total population. And as a consequence, the samples that we're drawing are not equally representative of the population. So we're waiting and creating all of these Frankenstein hybrid things. I mean, we had got into an interesting discussion about exit polling. 30 years ago, you just stood at exit polls and you intercepted people and talked to them. When we've got 2/3 of the population now claiming that they're going to vote either by mail or in advance on an absentee basis, or and only a third voting on election day, twice as many Republicans as Democrats claiming that is going to be the case. I mean, just contemplate how difficult that is to get a random probability sample that reflects the total population. So it's a problem. I mean, the big firms, are investing significantly in the science of this particular circumstance. And there also is something called the law of large numbers. I mean, if I interviewed everyone in America, my poll would be 100% right. And this is why you see the aggregators now, who are taking 20 polls together and mushing them all together on the assumption that whatever inherent errors are in all of those 20, that the law of large numbers will kind of reduce them and make them less than they would left on in isolation. Anyone else want to talk about Rick? You and I have been in the polling business for a long time. Oh, you're muted. You owe us $10 again.
What I would, isn't it a drink? What time is it? I'm in the West Coast. The other challenge about this, Alan, is in the days when there were like 2 or 3 networks and a limited number of media sources, you didn't have to actually sample quite as dispersed an audience to find the bits and pieces that are out there. The information distribution is also now quite discombobulated. So your danger in taking, getting a bad sample of the public is exaggerated by the fact that there is all these different streams of information flow. So it's easier to miss. Like I think what happened a lot of, and Les can speak to this better than I, but what happened in a lot of cases in 2016 is that the Trump campaign, contrary to expectations, had a better handle on who their base was, who their core vote was in those swing states. And they were doing that basically through social media, and particularly Facebook, which nobody had done before. They knew down to the individual who was responding to them, who was enthusiastically responding to them, who was liking and sharing and doing all of that other stuff that really are signs of commitment. And they had a handle on that, even though the Democratic campaign, the Clinton campaign, believed Trump had, quotes unquote, no ground game, whereas they had a strong ground game. Well, it turned out using the new technology, Trump had a stronger one. And I think that's another facet of what you're talking about with polls and a disaggregation of means of communications.
Last point being, and then I'll revert back to my moderator role, that the other thing that is at work here, and we've seen this before, I've seen this before in Canadian politics in polling. I mean, there's something called social desirability. We can find virtually no one who admits they cheat on their partner. We can find virtually no one who admits that they drink and drive. Back in the 1970s, I couldn't find anyone who said they were voting social credit in Alberta because it wasn't a socially desirable response to put forward. There is some suggestion that the polls do underrepresent Trump support for that very reason, that there are people who just simply do not want to be aligned with many things that they actually disagree with. But that always said, it's always a interesting area for controversy. I want to go back.
Well, Alan, can I add one more thing to that, if you don't mind,
Absolutely.
for the polling?
Absolutely.
And the other thing I'd add, and you guys have done polling, and I'm not a pollster, and I don't claim to be one, but I had an early education years ago working in a Senate race in a highly reputable polling firm working with the person's campaign. And as we're sitting around coffee table that morning having coffee before we started the day, he said, well, if only we had a poll that came out saying X. And the pollster looked us dead in the eyes and said, we can come up with a poll to say whatever you want it to say. And that was my education as far as going in the polling. And I think a lot of people feel that way too. It's like, no matter what I say in this poll, is that they can take the crosstabs and they can report whatever they want whenever they need. So I think there's a lot of that goes on too. As
a pollster, I don't know how long you'd be in business if that was the case, but that notwithstanding, Rick, I want to go off something that Sarah said. I mean, there's the prospect of an uncertain outcome based on key states not having their ballots counted. The other prospect, however, and it's not an either or situation, is that neither candidate concedes. What happens after that?
Well, that's the $1 million, $1 billion question of this election. Is President Trump serious about, if it's clear that he's lost, about holding up the process of that being, evident in terms of accepting the result, congratulating his opponent, et cetera, or is that turned into sort of Florida on steroids, Florida 2000 on steroids, where in half a dozen states or more, there are challenges and recounts, and not just recounts, but challenges to the legitimacy of ballots that could go on and on and on for weeks. Now, I mean, in the US system, the states actually have to appoint their electors to the Electoral College, and there's a fixed deadline for that, which is sort of independent of what I'm talking about. But it also includes some state legislatures are by nature partisan as well. There's some Republican ones and Democratic ones, that has some unpredictability to it as well. So in the worst case scenario, which is the one people sort of gravitate towards, but the one we hope isn't realistic, you could end up with chaos in terms of non-acceptance of the results and competing political threads going on between the presidential candidates and the parties versus what is happening in the state houses versus whatever might be transpiring in legal processes and challenges. And that could be really a very difficult period.
I want Les to just add there, because we all recall, and someone mentioned it earlier, the 2000 Gore-Bush campaign and the difficulty in determining what that outcome actually was. I mean, if we're in that kind of disputed or contested election outcome, are there strong precedents that would guide the system less, or are we in completely uncharted water?
Well, I think everybody's lawyering up, right? Everybody's getting ready to go to, is it Pennsylvania or is it Florida again? I'm old enough to remember I worked for Congress at the time in 2000. And, there we were for several days and weeks walking into work, and you're walking through everybody out protesting from the Supreme Court, right? And so it was very real. It's very surreal, I should say, and go through the process and lawyered up. Volunteers went to Florida, Palm Beach, as y'all remember, the Hanging Chads. And I think that's very real. I think you could see that again. Will it be a peaceful transition? I'll say yes, absolutely. But I think if you're either side, I think you will absolutely go through the process, legal means or otherwise, as far as trying to make sure everything was done accurately.
How does it end up at the Supreme Court? What's the process there?
Don't ask me. I'm not the legal scholar, but if you get there, who could write a better book of 2020 rather than where we are right now with having, as we talked about Supreme Court a minute ago, to have a confirmation process where she most likely be confirmed on October 26th, the latest, and then have this case come before, right? You just can't make these things up.
Let's go back to the old scenario, Sarah, that we actually take the popular vote numbers. We take the very first chart that that Charles put up there from Real Clear Politics, and Biden wins a decisive, undisputed result. How does that change Canada-U.S. relations, and what's different for Canada under a Biden presidency versus a Trump presidency?
Well, I think it's important to remember that, you know, in that realm of issues that kind of define the Canadian-U.S. relationship, most of those are nonpartisan. Most of those are apolitical issues that are negotiated through the two governments, regardless of administration. A lot of our key irritants between the two countries that we are still discussing are irritants that came up in the Obama administration or even preceding that. And so I don't think it really changes the nature of the relationship too much. There's a lot on the Biden platform that I think Canada should be concerned about. There's a kind of doubling down on Buy America as a key part of his economic program. There's, you know, procurement, for example. He would definitely escalate the amount of Buy American procurement requirements and the going down to the rules of origin. So a lot of the trade issues, Buy America issues, border issues, a lot of those, you know, Condoleezza Rice called them the condominium issues, those remain regardless of which administration you're dealing with. And I think that that's probably kind of the defining attributes of the relationship overall. What will change is kind of that philosophical alignment. And I don't know that that will be necessarily satisfying to the Canadian government. I think in many ways, the Trump administration has been a willing foil to the Trudeau government. And I think it may be something that complicates, you know, the Trudeau government's ability to get many issues passed through you know, the electorate here. And so I think that there's definitely some opportunities and challenges regardless of who wins the election.
Rick, we talked a little bit about this in the last webinar we did, but I mean, you follow the whole area of environment, resources, oil and gas. There's a lot of anticipation that a Biden presidency would focus on the green economy, green recovery, much more than Trump, and that would align much more with Canada. Do you see it that way?
In general, I do, Alan. But, you know, on this, we have to recognize that in both countries, there are really two realities. I mean, there are the people who are on board with a more aggressive emission reduction approach, which in the States is represented by 25 out of the 50 states, the so-called the Climate Coalition, Climate Action Coalition. And those 25 states represent 60% of American GDP. So the fact that they're aligned on an aggressive emission reduction program is quite a bit more close to the Canadian position. But of course, in Canada, we've got, you know, some variance between the federal and provincial governments on this, I mean, to say the least. So Biden coming back in at the national level would bring the national government, the US federal government, back into alignment with probably Canada by and large. And bring along the 25 states that are not part of that climate action coalition to some extent. But I mean, the American system is very decentralized, and Washington, as in Canada, can't just dictate to what the states would be. So, but it would probably bring us, you know, some people, and mostly in public, we talk about this as an environmental policy area. I think of it as an energy policy area. Because that's most of where emissions occur, is either in the production or the use of various forms of energy, or don't occur. And if you think about the North American energy market, I mean, going back to the days of Richard Nixon, it's really been thought of as an integrated energy economy. We sell oil and gas back and forth across that border. You know, we talk about importing oil from dictators in Canada, but really the most important supplier of oil to Canada is the United States of America, just as we're the biggest supplier of oil to America. And of course, our exports to America are like 25 times what we import back. The same thing was true of electricity. Our electricity exports are all to the United States of America. Our natural gas exports are almost all to the United States of America. So there's a lot of north-south integrated trade there, and Trump has disrupted all of that. But so has American politics generally. I mean, it was Obama who canceled the Keystone XL project, which Canada would still like to see happen. Trudeau would like to see it happen. Alberta would love to see it happen. The oil and gas industry needs it badly. Trump has reversed Obama's cancellation of it, and it's actually now under construction again. Biden is proposing or promising to cancel it if he gets elected. So I don't know. Now we're going to have a much more completed pipeline that Biden would be talking about canceling. Is he actually going to do something like that with something that's half built?
Probably not. But Les, independent of what this might mean for Canada-US relations, what would you anticipate being the biggest difference under a Biden presidency, other than the number of tweets coming out of the White House?
Well, the regulations, right? I mean, the number of regulations, as far as the environment and otherwise, that this administration has stricken it exceeded many people's expectations, right? So you would see a lot going towards the pipeline. There would be a lot of reverse of that for sure. And then as far as in working with Congress, if Biden wins, we may get to this later, you got to look at Congress, right? The House is going to stay Democrat. So will the Senate ride the coattails of Biden or will it stay with Trump? And so if it goes this an all Democrat town, talk about energy policy, just talk about that specifically. I think you have to look at the new Green Deal, and that has been discussed many times and discredited many times as well. But that's going to be something they're going to be working off of. So you're going to see a very active administration with a Congress. Now, it'd be different, obviously, if the Republicans held into the Senate and Biden won. There'd be a lot of fights going on there for sure. But I think you'll see a lot of policy changes and a lot more spending too, stimulus and otherwise.
What about Americans' role in the world? I mean, above and beyond the rhetoric, I think one of the things that confuses and alarms Canadians more than anything else about this Trump administration is his withdrawal from multinational and multilateral relations, whether it's NATO or WHO, or would that change dramatically under Biden, do you think?
Oh, yeah, oh, absolutely. That's the thing. You see so many people here in the States, and even more so the Republican Party, is like we like what the president is doing in so many things, regulations and policies. Would we like it without the tweets, without the rhetoric? Oh, absolutely. But you get what you get with President Trump. And just if you go back to 4 years ago in the Republican primaries, when he started racking up wins, and as we got towards Super Tuesday, and so many people wrong, including me, say there's no way this guy will win the South on Super Tuesday. He's not evangelical. He's, just go down the list of things. However, he won. And as his advisors, a small group of advisors said, let Trump be Trump. And he will continue to be Trump. He will continue to do the things he does because he sees as being successful no matter the carnage left behind.
Sarah, anything from our listeners that you want to bring up with the panel, or answer yourself for that matter? Anything there?
Actually, there's one that Les started to speak to that I think would be great if he could take on, which is the impact of the presidential vote on the down ballot races and how those are playing out.
Yeah, we had a little discussion on this earlier in some different races. And, there's some different states you can look at and say for the Senate to hold on to, they need to hold on to some of these. We talked about Maine earlier, right? With some of these different races, Colorado, Arizona, different places. And then get towards Minnesota, as we were talking earlier, and then some of the polls coming out. It's interesting seeing some of these races that were solid, or if not lean Democrat, I should say maybe a couple of these races in Michigan and Minnesota, and now they're going to the toss-up category. So what is that telling you? Is that telling you that people are now responding to polls? Go back to our polling question. Or is this saying there's just some erosion in some of that urban vote? As we said, you got to run up those votes, right, in the Minnesotas and different places, Northern Virginia, for them to win. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what the coattails will be. Georgia, I mean, you can get on the list of them of what that's going to mean for them, because if the Senate does go Democrat once again and Vice President Biden wins the White House, you will see, I think, some historic legislation that'll be passed. You look at the first 100 days, look at the first 2 years that would happen.
For sure. Notwithstanding where we started with the aggregated polls, Biden being 10 points up, no one seems to be very quick to write Trump off at this stage. I mean, notwithstanding the vigor of his campaign, it strikes me he's promised virtually nothing. Rick, under a re-elected Trump administration, is it going to be business as usual, or is there actually a prospect for new initiatives, new programs, new directions to come out of a re-elected Trump administration?
I think that's a really interesting question, Alan. You know, and one of the things that changes presidents between a first term and a second term, presidents who get a second term, is personality. I mean, they become more settled. They become more focused on the long-term legacy implications of their tenure in office and so on. They're not any longer worrying about a re-election strategy for 3 to 1 years down the road. They're able to focus on things that are less immediately popular. Some of the, you've used the phrase in the past, what we've got into in politics is an era where what's good politics is bad policy, and what's good policy is often bad politics. That doesn't matter as much for a second-term president. It does matter for the down ballot, the senators and members of Congress in his party, but he's got more freedom to act. And so, I'm sort of putting this in personality terms because, as you say, he doesn't really have an election platform in a traditional sense, but also the phenomenon of Trump is mostly about personality. And is it possible to imagine that personality changing simply because he's not facing another election? I think it is. But, does that make him more broad-minded, more open to views that are not his own? It could. And if it did do that, it could be quite a productive term. I know that a lot of people will see that as a pretty rosy interpretation of the personality. Because he so often is reflexive rather than reflective, but not always. I mean, if you see what he's doing in the Middle East, for instance, there's actually some progress being made in places that's been hard traditionally for Israel to improve relations. And I think the Trump influence has been helping that along. And that's one of the few areas where you can point to a patient strategy playing out in probably what's going to be an enduring and constructive fashion. But it's just one thing. And can we see more of that and across more fields? Possibly.
I want to get to Trump's personality with Les in a moment, but first I want to give Sarah the opportunity to weigh in on Trump 2.0. Did you anticipate anything significantly different if reelected?
In some ways, yes. I think that, he's spent a lot of the last 4 years doing things that could be considered campaigning for this election. And so I think that there is, in a second term, the ability to be more retrospective, like Rick mentioned. I also think that there's a lot of these kind of legacy issues that that he does have a focus on. And there's always been this discussion that inside the White House, some of his key advisors have a list of executive orders and kind of next round initiatives for the second term already planned out. The challenge will be whether or not the Senate is aligned with him. And so I think that, if you have a President Trump with a Democratic Senate, things become a lot more difficult for him to implement any kind of legislative agenda. And it hasn't been easy, even with the situation he has right now.
Rick raised the issue of Trump's personality last night. You're right in Washington, you're watching him every day. He seems congenitally unable to admit defeat or that he's been bested by anyone or anything. How likely is it that this guy is going to refuse to accept election results, regardless of what the results are, and claim foul, corruption, rotten campaign?
Yeah, I mean, listen, we'd be crazy to think if we didn't hear some of this rhetoric after the election, if it was close or if it was declared he won on election night, and then they have to count more votes, and then it changes. I mean, we will hear the rhetoric. Why would things change on that? End of the day, I mean, there will be a peaceful transition. I mean, this is America, right? We break a lot of glass, but we end up cleaning it up and sweeping it up and moving along for sure. So I have full faith in this administration and members of Congress and others. If it comes to that, things will work out. Not always smoothly. We have to rough out some of the edges, but we usually come together. We always come together, I would say.
Sarah, Rick, you want to speculate on that question at all? Or is it something you'd rather avoid?
No, I think that was a great answer by Les. But Rick, unless you want to weigh in, I've got an excellent question here from the Q&A that I'd like to pose.
Go for it.
All right, so this question actually is about how this election is going to impact the Canadian politics in the future. So the question is, how would you summarize the key items that the Canadian federal government and Canadian political parties are watching in this election? And are there takeaways for a Canadian election in the future?
Rick, you want to talk about that?
Tough question. There's a little recognized in Canada, because there's such an overwhelming disapproval of Trump, is that there is a 20% approval group of Trump in Canada, and within the conservative movement, that's about 40%. And those folks are onboarding a lot of Trump's approach to politics, including a more aggressive, oversimplified, wedging kind of approach to politics, which makes consensus building and collaboration and cross-party cooperation on legislating and so on harder to achieve. And you see that in Canada, although you also see the opposite of it, a reaction against Trump and a warning about the dangers of going down that path and the division it's causing in the United States. So I would say that this is still a kind of formative piece of Canadian politics. If Trump were reelected, I think we would probably find quite a lot of reinforcing of people who are supportive of Trump in Canada, and more of his tactics being adopted here. And I don't think that would be a terrific thing for Canada. But if he's defeated, if he's a one-term president, I think that most Canadians would be quite happy to walk away from that era and get on with politics in a more normal way. But I do think that that's not going to be easy either, because Trump has effectively fractured the old approaches to politics.
I want to ask each of you, getting close to the end here, and starting with Sarah. I mean, while Blaston, you confirmed a fairly optimistic notion that their peaceful transition is going to happen, it strikes me that it's pretty predictable that we're going to have a certain amount of chaos. I don't mean violence in the streets or anything, but uncertainty following this election. What should the government of Canada do? If you were advising Justin Trudeau and his cabinet, and I want Rick and I want you to come to Canada and do the same advice to Les, each of you say, what should Canada do if things are uncertain, if things are not nailed down, if there's a lot of disputes going on, legal challenges? Just be quiet. Is there anything we should do?
I would say from Canada's perspective, what we care about is the relationship, the long-term relationship between the countries, not with any particular politician or any particular administration. And we should send constructive and reassuring messages as much as we can to help calm the waters and to keep people focused on the long-term relationship, both defense, environmental, economic, cultural, familial, tourism. I mean, all of the parts that are parts of this complex relationship, and just keep people focused on Americans are having a hard time. We'll do what we can to help. We want to keep business, people moving as freely as possible. Kind of reassuring, constructive messages like that, rather than get ourselves immersed in any of the internal argumentation back and forth.
Sarah, you want to add to that?
I think that that's kind of a code among diplomats, that you don't wade into the domestic affairs of another country, and so I think that this very much is categorized as one of those items. But I do think that there is significant concern within the Canadian government watching the United States election and watching the civil unrest that's occurred over the last year, because it's not just about this election. We've had civil unrest on COVID recovery efforts. We've had civil unrest on racial issues, and most of those things have also been repeated up here in Canada. And so I think there is some appetite on some a reasonable expectation that the Canadian government will be watching this quite closely, not so much to see what happens within the United States, but to see how that plays out on this side of the border as well.
Les, we know that the American government don't think about Canada that often, but is there anything Canada could do to make things a little calmer, to make things a little bit more certain in the United States?
And saying all is well. All is well. All is well. If y'all can just keep telling us that, and things will change next year. It's been a hectic year. I mean, the world's dealing with a pandemic, and then to the point of the civil unrest, it's just one thing after another. The politics is what it is, and I think one of the main things is like at the national level, people just aren't used to the in your face type of commentary that President Trump has. That's more of a local, or even, I wouldn't even say state. It's more of a local politics in America, and we're dealing with. To see at this level, I think is unnerving for some people for sure. And once again, we'd rather not have that. At the same time, as far as Canada, I think once again, I think it could take a few days, right, after the election, still counting votes. And so, yeah, to your point and Sarah's point, as far as you're not picking sides, we'll sort it out. Y'all, the great thing about Canada is that y'all are able and willing to work with the United States of America, no matter who is in control and who's in charge, whether you agree with the politics or not. And that's what makes us great partners at the end of the day.
Last question to each of you in turn, starting with Sarah. On election night, what are you going to be watching for? What's the one signal that's going to give you the insight in terms of what might transpire after the fact?
Well, I think it'll be how close the votes are on the East Coast. And so a lot of those kind of key swing states or toss-up states are on the East Coast and have those early polling closure times. So how close those are, if they're even able to call some of those states and some of the districts within those states, I think will let us know into how tight a race this is going to be for the rest of the night.
Rick,
And
what are you going to do?
weeks.
What are you going to look at for?
I'll be looking a bit more Midwest than Sarah's outlining. I mean, yes, North Carolina, Florida on the East Coast will be key states to watch. Pennsylvania, but I think the biggest surprise in 2016 came in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, also Pennsylvania. That Midwestern belt. And if the Democrats are recovering in those states, I think they'll be off to a really good evening. If they're not, we're into some sort of a replay of 2016.
Les, what do you be looking for?
South Carolina. What's going on in South Carolina, right? Lindsey Graham, chairman of the Judiciary Committee, should be a shoe-in. He's having a race, and the amount of money being poured into that state because there's blood in the water over there. What happens there? Does it come home? If it comes home, does that mean the rest of the nation comes home?
Interesting. All of you are looking for some aspect of geography. Anyone looking for the behavior of the two principal contenders as the best signal to what we can expect next?
Aren't they going to play it tight? Biden will be calm and reassuring, and if he's leading, claiming victory, but Trump will be yelling at everybody about what's happening in some state or some busload of ballots that he found in a ditch somewhere. If any deviation from that would be worth noting, but I don't think that that's what we're going to see.
Anyone want any final words, Sarah?
Well, I would just say the decision is out of their hands by that point, right? So I think really, watching the electorate and watching, I think it's also going to be really critical to see how people are behaving on the streets outside the polling centers and in states that are doing more in-person and on-day voting. And so I think that may give us some indicators on how much damage this election has done to the United States in the long run. Because I think, going back to something I said the last time we had one of these, is the United States remains a divided nation, and there is no one leader that's going to create a real unified vision of purpose. The United States it's in its character to have a divided perspective. And so how virulent those divisions are, I think will be something that we'll be watching for, not just on November 3rd, but in the weeks after.
Last word to you, Les.
Yeah, I think last night, tonight, obviously last night, we got to see these two on stage and how they react to one another. So will that change, going back to what we said earlier in this, will that change people's votes? Probably not many votes, but it will either embolden those to get out to vote or take your foot off the gas, as we discussed earlier.
Really good conversation. I want to thank you, Sarah, Rick, Les, for joining us, our special guest. Real pleasure having you. Thank all the people who tuned in. I want you to know that if we didn't get to one of your questions, we'll make an effort to get back to you and answer it directly. In addition, we will be sending out a link so that to our YouTube channel, so that anyone who wants to spend copious time going over all these pithy comments will have that at their availability. And otherwise, tune in on November 5th, I think that's right, where we're going to do this US election one last time, and that hopefully that things will be sufficiently clear that we'll have a pathway of discussion that can continue to anticipate what's going to happen going forward. So with that, thank you all, and be safe and take care.